September 11th, 2001. A clear autumn morning becomes a day of infamy. It is a terrible tragedy that the world will never forget. But there are those who are reminded of another disaster that is eerily similar. Saturday, July 28, 1945. Manhattan is wrapped in a cloak of low-lying clouds. It's another rainy morning in a month of bad weather. 200 miles from New York City, Lieutenant Colonel William Smith prepares to take off from the Army Air Force Base in Bedford, Massachusetts. At 37, William Smith is a decorated war hero who has survived some of the toughest bombing missions of the war.
In over 50 missions, he was unscathed, and the same crew stayed with him. No one was harmed, no one was injured. The plane always would come back with flak in it, and he insisted on staying with the same plane, and they'd patch that one up, and he'd go up again.
With the war in Europe at an end, Smith returns home to be with his wife Martha and to meet his 18-month-old son for the first time. While waiting for reassignment, his job is to chauffeur other officers between bases. Today, he is flying a B-25 to pick up his commanding officer in Newark.
He had never flown a B-25 before, but he had flown a B-17, which was over twice the size or more. So for him, it was a piece of cake. So they gave him rudimentary training in it, a little bit up in the air, and then that was it.
In the co-pilot seat is 31-year-old flight engineer Christopher Dimitrovich and a last-minute hitchhiker, Navy machinist's mate Albert Perna. With the weather getting worse, Smith requests a direct instrument flight to Newark. This means that he will fly blind with only his onboard instruments and ground control to guide him. His request is denied unless he can postpone his flight until later that morning. Smith doesn't want to wait. He's due in Newark at 10 a.m., and he means to be on time. He sets his sights on LaGuardia Airfield, 15 miles northeast of Newark, where weather conditions are slightly better. Smith knows that Pilot William Smith and his co-pilot Sergeant Chris Dimitrovich take off with the fuel tanks in the B-25 filled to capacity, just in case they need to turn back. 9:30 a.m., Midtown Manhattan. On 5th Avenue between 33rd and 34th Streets stands 102 stories of granite and Indiana limestone. It's the Empire State Building, the tallest structure in the world. On this particular Saturday, there are about 2,000 people in the building. Many are office staff working on the weekend. Althea Lethbridge is on the 70th floor.
I was not supposed to be working. The other girl had some activity she wanted to go to, so I took her place that morning.
On the 79th floor, Catholic War Relief Services occupies the entire west side. By 9:30 that morning, the weekend staff is busy in the office. 19-year-old Therese Fortier is at her desk.
I was a secretary. Most of what I did was take dictation, type up letters, take care of mail that had to do with Polish displaced persons, because the woman I worked for, Mary Kajerska, was in charge of the Polish project.
Mary Kidzierski works in the office next to Joe Fountains, the director of the Prisoner of War project. In the corner office, Public Relations Director Paul Deering is working on a newspaper article about troops returning home. On the street below, 17-year-old Donald Maloney, a hospital apprentice with the Coast Guard, wonders if he should visit the Empire State Building after all. Meanwhile, visibility is poor at LaGuardia Airfield. The ceiling of cloud and fog is descending rapidly. To stay under it, Lieutenant Colonel William Smith drops his B-25 to 650 feet. He radios LaGuardia, asking for clearance to land at the New Jersey airfield.
The air traffic controller in the LaGuardia Tower that day was a man named Victor Barden, a veteran. He really had the New York weather imprinted in his mind. He used a telltale. If he could not see the television mast from LaGuardia on the Empire State Building, he said, "Land here." That morning, he used those very words. He said, "Captain Smith, I cannot see the television tower on the Empire State Building. I think you should land here."
Smith insists on landing in Newark. Since the B-25 is already in violation for flying below the 1,000-foot minimum, Barden contacts the Army for instruction. With visibility in New Jersey improving to 1,000 feet, the Army gives LaGuardia the go-ahead to allow Smith to continue to Newark.
However, there was one caveat. They said you have to fly below the clouds, you have to fly with the visibility of 1,500 feet, and if you lose sight, now this is the ultimate irony, if you lose sight at the top of the Empire State Building, you have to turn back.
For Bill Smith, there is no turning back. He is about to make the mistake of his life.
As he reached the outskirts of Manhattan, he could see enough of the ground to identify landmarks. His problem was that he was totally disoriented. As he came over the East River and the 59th Street Bridge loomed, he mistook that for the Hudson River and the George Washington Bridge, which is some 2 miles to the north or more. At that moment, he started to lower his wheels, and he was down below 500 feet with the wheels down when he suddenly realized he was over Midtown Manhattan. He kicked left rudder and he straightened out, and he was on a beeline for the Empire State Building, flying straight up Fifth Avenue.
July 28th, 1945, 9:55 a.m. Just another Saturday in Midtown Manhattan. Outside, the tallest building in the world is shrouded in fog. Inside, it's business as usual. On the 70th floor, Althea Lethbridge is in her boss's office taking dictation. Above her, 20-year-old elevator operator Betty Lou Oliver has just dropped a passenger off at the 79th floor and is on her way back down. In the offices of Catholic War Relief Services on the 79th floor, Secretary Therese Fortier barely notices the rumble of approaching thunder. Just 500 feet below, startled pedestrians hear the sound of the B-25 as its pilot, Lieutenant Colonel William Smith, frantically weaves through the maze of Midtown office buildings.
He flew for his life, basically. He was originally on the course for what is now the Helmsley Building at 45th Street and Park Avenue. He veered away from that, veered southwesterly, and found himself on a line with 500 Fifth Avenue at 42nd Street.
Here in the B-25, it was evident from people on the ground who watched the movements of the plane as it veered right, left, as it tried to climb, then it lowered, that there was a great deal of panic going on in that cockpit. People in the Radio City Center area were looking out their windows and could see the faces in the cockpit. That's how close the plane was flying at that level altitude down Fifth Avenue.
It is 9:55 a.m. Smith is flying blind at over 200 miles per hour. He is trying to climb, but the lowered landing gear slows him down. He is at 900 feet when the Empire State Building suddenly looms into view. In the observation tower on the 102nd floor, Lieutenant Alan Amon sees the B-25 burst through the clouds. He throws his wife to the floor. The plane is headed right toward them. Traveling in an upward direction, the 12-ton B-25 slams into the Empire State Building between the 78th and 79th floors. The explosion is similar to the ones that will rock Manhattan more than a half a century later.
Suddenly, the whole building shook, and there was this loud explosion. It was very loud. We both jumped up and immediately went to the window.
My own thoughts were that maybe it was a bomb, because the war still wasn't over completely.
The nose of the plane smashes through the row of windows on the 79th floor. The cockpit flattens on impact. Lieutenant Colonel William Smith, Sergeant Chris Dimitrovich, and machinist's mate Albert Perna are killed instantly. In his corner office, Paul Deering tries to run. The explosion hurls him through one of the windows, and he falls to his death. The wings of the B-25 shear off as the aircraft impales itself in the side of the building. Hundreds of gallons of gasoline spew from ruptured fuel tanks as the right-wing engine breaks free and flies across the office. A deluge of flaming fuel rains down on 3 secretaries still at their desks. The heat is so intense that it melts the glass and metal partitions that surround them. A wave of fire washes over Mary Kadzierski as oxygen tanks from the B-25 fly into a nearby cubicle shared by 2 female bookkeepers. In the intense heat, the oxygen tanks explode. Traveling at 200 miles per hour, the landing gear and a section of oil tank punch through the opposite side of the skyscraper and plummet to the roof of the Waldorf building next door. The left-wing engine deflects into the bank of elevators in the 78th floor corridor. It slices easily through the steel and brick shafts that house cars 6 and 7. Alone in car number 6, elevator operator Betty Lou Oliver is doing what she often does when she is by herself.
And she'd sit on the floor of the cage and she would sing. And that morning she was singing the St. Louis Blues when the engine, traveling at well over 300 miles an hour, cut all 16 lifting cables of her elevator and sent it shooting down the elevator shaft.
Bouncing off the shaft's steel firewall, the blazing engine follows the elevator down, smashing into the roof as the car accelerates faster and faster.
Somewhere around the 40th floor, she became weightless, and she started to levitate in the cage, literally about halfway in the cage. And when she landed, most of the walls, the 4 walls, fell in on top of her.
Outside, the explosions send shockwaves across Midtown Manhattan as bright orange flames shoot as high as the observatory on the 86th floor.
It was terrifying. I have no idea about how the fire department people got up there, but on the street it was like something you'd see in Hollywood. I mean, it couldn't have had more mayhem.
Saturday, July 28, 1945. 15 minutes after a B-25 bomber crashes into the Empire State Building, young Arthur Weingarten arrives on the scene with his father.
When we got there, which was approximately 15 minutes after the crash, the tail section of the plane was sticking out of the building on the 79th floor. There was aviation fuel, about 6 or 7 streams, rivers of fuel running down the north side of the building. Broken glass and metal all over the streets, and dozens of people lying on the ground.
Hundreds of firefighters are already on the scene. So is a 17-year-old Coast Guardsman named Donald Maloney.
He rushed into the Walgreens drugstore on 33rd Street, said, "Give me morphine, give me bandages, give me everything you got." But without any cash transaction. He was given this stuff, and off he went.
Maloney follows a squad of firefighters to the sub-basement, where they find elevator car number 6 embedded in the concrete floor. Miraculously, Betty Lou Oliver is alive inside.
He raced down and he wedged himself on a rope down 3 stories below the lobby level and administered morphine to Betty Lou Oliver and got all the girders off her. And in effect, of course, saved her life.
Firefighters are already taking the stairs to the upper levels of the stricken skyscraper. Like their counterparts on September 11th, 50 years later, their own safety is the last thing on their minds. The climb is made more difficult by the hundreds of anxious office workers on their way down.
So I knew I couldn't get on the elevator, and I turned to go back to the office when a man came walking along the hall, and he said he knew where the exit was. So, hanging onto his coattails, literally, that's not just an expression. It was dark. The lights had been knocked out, and we started down the stairway.
Therese Fortier and her co-workers have survived the initial explosions. Dazed and confused, they are shocked to see Joe Fountain run out of the flames, his hair burned away, his body blistered and charred.
The aviation fuel had covered him, and he ran flaming through the office, yelling for all the women to get out.
So we went into this one office, which was Father Swanstrom's office, and closed the door. The 6 of us and Mr. Fountain. We opened the window, and this was on the south end, and we could see flames coming up from below, out from the window. And I had a handkerchief, put it across my mouth and my nose to filter the smoke, because it was black acrid smoke.
Suddenly, those huddled on the 79th floor hear shattering glass as firefighters force their way into the ravaged reception area and begin dousing the fire.
But eventually, firemen did come in, broke the glass on the door, and carried us out. And we came out of 34th Street and looked up, and you could see the plane sticking out of the building.
In the end, the disaster claims 14 lives. Many of the dead are identified by watches, inscribed bracelets, and engagement rings. Miraculously, no firefighters in the building or pedestrians on the ground are killed. Joe Fountain dies after lingering in a coma for 3 days. Despite her terrible injuries, Betty Lou Oliver makes a miraculous recovery. She lives to have 3 children and become a grandmother. Donald Maloney serves as a medic in Korea, where he is wounded 8 times while caring for others. The most amazing survivor is the Empire State Building herself. Unlike many modern office towers built to be light in construction with external steel supports, the Empire State Building is protected by heavy limestone blocks backed by 8 inches of brick. Internal columns support solid floors of steel-reinforced concrete. Despite the damage, the world's tallest building is repaired and fully operational in just 3 months.
The construction was such, and the concrete and fire retardant materials, the fires were contained to the 79th and 78th floor, never spread anywhere else.
An investigation is handled by both the Federal Aviation Authority and the City of New York.
The report came to the conclusion that Bill Smith was unfamiliar with the area, unfamiliar with the aircraft, that it stopped short of condemning him at being the end fault, but that he was a linkage in the fault.
The accident also brings about necessary changes in regulations for flights going over New York City.
In essence, pilots would not fly over Manhattan south of 110th Street. If a plane was going to fly over the city, it would have to be at a minimum of 2,000 feet.
They changed that to 2,500 feet, and that's pretty much standard throughout the country now. They made it a rule. The air traffic controller tells you to land, you